How do I select the intended outcomes, outputs, and appropriate measures in a grant application for my project, program, or initiative? Well, that's what we'll be talking about in this video. The connection between these things, these elements of program design, are critical for a funder. One of the more sophisticated ways in which a funder will evaluate a project application, a project design plan, is to see how well these items are linked, your outputs, your outcomes, and your measures. So they want to see the connection, and they need to see that very clearly. There shouldn't be too much left up in the air. So I'm going to talk through three things that will be important for you to consider when you're looking at this part of the application or when you're looking at this part of the program design. So I'm Benjamin Dean from grantgating.com. Thank you so much for jumping into this video. This one and all other videos like it on this channel are aimed at helping you get more grants. Down in the description is a link to 10 proven strategies for selecting the appropriate outcomes, outputs, and measures. In this video, we're going to be covering 3 high-level things to touch on. So number 1, let's actually start with outcomes. So in terms of a, sort of linear progression, you would have your measures, you would have your outputs, and you would have your outcomes. But we're going to start with the furthest downstream, or what we are aiming to do. The outcomes, again, if you have a logic model, if you don't, please watch the logic model videos on this channel for a guide in how to create those. But these are elements, for the most part, from a logic model or from a logical way in which one would set up a program, an intervention, stemming from a theory of change. So your outcomes are typically your more downstream effects. What is happening because of the activities that you are undertaking? What is happening because of the outputs? And your outcomes are going to be really the why behind your project. They are the change that is happening. Now, again, for just a quick comparison, if you are in the business of assisting families with their health outcomes, where you want to increase their nutrition, you want to increase their physical capabilities, you want to increase their mobility, their mental acuity, whatever those things are, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be intervening in some way. And so that is maybe a visit to a clinic, that might be home visits, that might be telemedicine or health sort of operations. Those are the interventions, and those are countable. How many times you got on the phone, how many home deliveries you had, how many visits to your clinic. Those are all outputs. Those are the things that you're counting. But you're counting them, you're tracking them, because you're aiming towards something further downstream. A change in behavior, a change in knowledge, a change in environment or experience. So these are your whys. What is the difference that you're aiming to make? Funders want to know that what you're doing will change that it will change something in the environment. There will be some starting place or a baseline. And then towards the end or at the end of your project, there is a change. Okay, whether that's in things like improved community health, increased literacy, reduced homelessness, increased food security, these sorts of things. These are the downstream effects. So when you're defining your outcomes, you want to keep them as specific and realistic as you can. Now, this is all, if you're new to this might seem like a bit of a contradiction, but at the same time you want to be specific and realistic, you also want to take into account the bigger picture. Now, depending on the grant application and how it is formatted, you may be able to do that all together in a narrative piece where some outcomes, some intake forms or applications will request your outcomes and allow you to expand on the meaning of them a bit more. in that exact section, in that exact box or a sub box underneath it. If this is the case, then you can sort of manipulate, not in a negative way, but manipulate what those outcomes are to take both very long-term downstream impacts into account as you're defining your outcomes. And that is really ideal. Okay, because the closer you can tie all these things together as succinctly as you can so that someone can understand it and that it can actually be done, of course, the better, all other things equal. If it can be very clearly articulated that what it is you are doing will create something very profound and important to that funder downstream, that's what we're looking for. Because typically you're going to be applying for funding not for the outcome directly, but you will be applying for funding for the outputs, right? You're saying, hey, I would love to have some money from you to be able to spin up this new clinic in our community. We have 40% raised. We need another 60%. Your X number of thousands of dollars that will cover the rest of this project's initiation. And so you're paying us to spin this clinic up. And in so doing, we will have some outcomes for you downstream. But in order to get to those outcomes, we have these things coming along the way. Those are measures and outputs. So again, there's a bigger picture. What's really downstream typically is a group or a community, or what is the change in the environment within which you work. A little bit further upstream is the individuals that are having a change in behavior, a change in knowledge, or a change in experience. Okay, so in those grant applications where you're able to articulate that these things are tied together, that this output will directly impact this outcome, we get enough of those outcomes together, this is going to improve this in our community or in this group or in our environment. Okay, so in the example of an application that doesn't have that ability, you don't have that ability to really expand and further articulate on things, then you're going to look for other ways to talk to or speak to those more downstream impacts elsewhere in the application. Okay, so it's one of those things when you look at an application and you're looking at these outputs, outcomes, impacts, the measures, all of this together, you're sort of seeing how this is laid out, what it is that they're asking for, while considering what is important. You're going to game plan where you're going to put some of these critical tie-ins together. So the main point, again, in this video is that you want to tie them together somehow. Okay. And in so doing, if that is one of the goals that you have, which it should be in an application, then there's a strategy to which outputs and which outcomes you're able to select most appropriately. Okay, so instead of saying, in terms of outcomes, instead of saying your outcome is to increase literacy, a much stronger outcome would be to improve reading comprehension in 200 at-risk youth by 20% over the next 12 months, right? So again, you're using a SMART framework for anything that you're doing, whether it's SMART goals, SMART objectives, SMART outcomes, it doesn't matter. You're being specific and measurable in everything that you possibly can so that it's clearly understood and so that you can tie other things in very clearly. Again, grant writing, and you may know this already, but one of the keys to grant writing is a complete thought without loose ends. Loose ends, or things that one might have to interpret or intuit or assume in reading a grant application in terms of how it all fits together, those are, yellow flags at best, or yellow lights, kind of slow down lights, maybe not red flags, maybe not red lights, but at best, they don't improve your application to have things open-ended. So I like to think about it as a complete thought. And these parts of the application, the measures, outputs, and outcomes, they are really key to tying everything together. Okay, so using SMART frameworks for all of this is important. So that's your outcome. Your outcome, very specific change in behavior or knowledge. So you'll think about it. Another way to think about it with the outcome is that there will be something to measure at the beginning of the project. And I'm using beginning in terms of the grant application. Most of the time, these are arbitrary start and end dates because you're operating anyway, for the most part. But at the start of the project, there's a data collection, quantitative and qualitative. And that which you're measuring there is also what you're going to be measuring at the end and potentially at the middle to track the progress. So if you say something like increased literacy, which sounds great. I want increased literacy in my community. Everybody does. Nobody says I want people to, I want decreased literacy, right? It's an obvious yes, but it's not specific and it's not anything that you can baseline data on for the most part, right? So you want to be as specific as you can. And then, the final sort of point that I'll make here, and there are others, but the final point is, again, in any program, anyone, there are multiple outcomes. So when you look at your program, project, or initiative, I'm just saying program here, when you're looking at it, you will have hopefully already done the work of identifying all of the outcomes that come from the activities that you are doing, the activities and outputs. If you haven't done that, you should do that, because it doesn't matter if the outcomes were intended or were unintended when you started. If you have some track record and you can look back and look at where you're at and also project forward, nobody cares if you intended to do it or not. If it is something that is real, meaningful, and trackable, and in some way increases quality of life, or some way of saying that increases some positive outcomes, some positive changes in your community, then it needs to be on the list. Because when you sit down and you're applying for multiple different grants, you have multiple different priorities in all of these grants, and you need to be able to mix and match to allow your programs to be applicable to multiple funders. Okay, and the outcomes are maybe one of the most critical pieces for you to understand to do that. Okay, that's where you're going to. Then, number 2, tangible outputs. So while the outcomes are more of the longer term impact or changes, the outputs are the immediate measurable actions or products that your project will deliver or serve. So these are the direct results of your work. Okay, you don't ever have an intervention that immediately increases literacy. If we use that generic example, you're going to have an output of an activity such as number of books acquired, number of books distributed, number of sessions held, number of interventions held with parents, number of interventions held with teachers, right? All these things that are part of the program for which you are receiving funding for. So these need to be tangible as you possibly can, and as direct as you possibly can, directly tied to the service, the work that you're doing. Okay, could be, again, if you're doing food, if you're serving meals, it is the number of meals. It is the number of people served on a given day. It is perhaps very important in your model to have an efficient system. So it's the number of families served per hour of operations, right? Those are all things that are trackable, that are very much tied to the outcome of, say, increased food security for a particular demographic for a particular period of time. Okay, so if, again, your outcome is improving literacy, your output might be something like conducting 50 literacy workshops serving 200 students. Okay, so again, to the degree that you can think about SMART framework, that's where you want to start. Always start with SMART. Now, not every grant application, again, is going to allow you to do this. But that doesn't mean that in the example or in the instance when you're filling out a grant application and it's a drop-down menu, and sort of pre-filled situation going on, where you don't have a lot of ability to really change things in the application. That doesn't mean you can't have a little bit of a workbook outside of the application, translating what that is into something that is smarter. Okay, that does have a time-bound aspect to it, that is completely trackable, right, and attainable, and all these things, right? So you can always create this back end on any of these projects. And the more that you're able to do that on your outputs, the more you'll be able to reference that back end and apply it to other grant opportunities. Okay. For those that are writing grants, you're not just writing one grant. And if you are, that's fine too. But and you will find value in these videos, but that's not how most nonprofits need to be looking at things, in my opinion. There is so much out there that any step along the way that you can take a moment to reflect and say, how would I approach this given that I know that I want to apply for 15 other similar grants? What is the work that I can do now in the infrastructure of grant writing that will allow me to have succinct applications across multiple funders, but also to do so in an efficient way, because we only have so much time and there's more grants coming every single day. Okay, so that's output. So output's very, very tangible, very, very direct, and without a doubt tied directly to your outcomes. How do we tie them in? That's the next point. The next point is how do you do this? Well, some of these things are obvious to you. You might say, of course, by providing fresh and healthy food to 100 underserved individuals in our community, that of course is going to increase some outcome, increase food security in the future. But that still needs to be clearly articulated, even if it's just one sentence somewhere in that section or in a subsequent or previous section where you're able to do that. Now, how do you do it? There's a variety of different ways. You can look at your historical data. If you have historical data that tracks some of these things, if you've had previous project programs or initiatives where you've done pre and post quantitative application, sort of intake, that's one way. Another way is, qualitative on your own data, your own client base or your own data, to say, we have testimonials from X number of people stating certain phrases or certain things that indicate to us that they have increased whatever the outcome is, health outcomes, nutritional outcomes, environmental outcomes. You have qualitative information that says because of these activities and outputs, we are seeing these outcomes, right? Here's proof of that. And then another way to do it would be to benchmark other organizations and the work that they have done. It is very unlikely that you watching this video are doing something that has never been done before. It is extremely likely that whatever it is you're doing, somebody has done it before and they've done it really well. And they have already done the surveys. They have already proven to their funders that which they are being funded to do, the activities and outputs, are directly tied to the outcome. So you can always look for third party in the form of other community-based organizations. And that could be anywhere. It does not have to be in your community. It probably shouldn't be in your community. It'd probably be a lot easier to reach out and talk to folks that are further along than you are in your space outside of your community to obtain some of that information. How do you do that? You get on the phone and you call somebody. You get in your car and you drive somewhere if they're close enough. You send off an email. You send off some DMs if you can connect with them on LinkedIn or some other social platform. And you just ask. You just say, hey, I saw that you ran this program. I'm assuming you had some, funders that you needed to report to. We're doing a similar program all the way over here in California. You're all the way over in Maine. We don't really affect each other, but I would love to take 15 minutes of your time to understand how you got from your outputs to your outcomes and what you did to track it and what sort of results you have. You record that, conversation or otherwise take really good notes, and you can reference that as a third-party connection between your outputs and your outcomes. The last way you can do it to connect your outputs to your outcomes, the last one I'll talk about here, is just third-party research. Okay? There are millions and millions of scholarly articles, research articles on everything in human services, basic needs services, environmental, interventions, pretty much anything that you can think of that study different aspects of what works best to make a change in a community. Okay, so Google Scholar, using an AI software to help pull some of that research in, using Google, whatever the case is, finding that third-party research and then just referencing it in your application somewhere, somehow, footnotes, linking, particular articles if you have that ability. Plenty of ways to do that. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this video is just to say, do it. Make it tied together. Okay, so that's outputs. The last note on here is the measures. Selecting the right measures is essential to demonstrate how you'll track the outputs and the outcomes. These metrics will help you assess whether your project is on pace to achieve its goals. Important to be choosing a mix of qualitative and quantitative measures, depending on the nature of your project, but you always want to consider both as data. Two types of data, qualitative and quantitative. Okay, please don't forget that because it's a missed opportunity many, many times. Quantitative measures might include things like tracking of attendance, the test scores, the number of services delivered, while qualitative measures could involve participant feedback, interviews, focus groups, anecdotal conversations. Every other day you go out there and you talk with volunteers, you talk with your clients, you talk with your community partners, and you catalog those conversations. If you do that enough, you have a large enough sample size where that is now a data point that you can use. Okay, so another way to think about this is KPIs. So many applications don't directly ask for measures. Some do, some don't. But in a for-profit sense, you can also think about measures as key performance indicators. So they're things that are trackable based on the activities that you're doing, but they may not be something that you put as an output, right? That you might hold up and say, this is the output that we want to have. Again, in any program, project, or initiative, you're going to have many outputs. Or many, we'll say, instead of many outputs, we'll say many things that you can track. Okay, almost an infinite number of things you can track, especially if you just layer, one additional thing on top of or underneath, depending on how you look at it, in terms of moving the data around, right? So just cross-sectioning different parts of your data to say these number of people repeated over the next 3 months. How many people came back within 3 months of their first visit, right? That's something that takes a little bit of, data work, not very much if you're tracking these sorts of things, but it can be another layer of something that turns out to be very important towards the goal of an outcome. Okay, so your measures are going to be things that are going to be leading you in the direction of your outputs that you've selected in your outcomes, making sure you're on track. Okay, by following these, you're going to have a well-rounded approach to your program design, selecting the outcomes, outputs, and your measures. Don't forget at the bottom here in the description, I think it's actually at the top, there's a link for 10 more strategies relating to this topic of selecting outputs, outcomes, and measures. Okay, 10 proven strategies. Thank you so much for jumping in. I hope this was helpful. Again, this is Benjamin Dean from grantgiving.com, and we will see you in the next video.